The eternal conclave station hung in the void like a god's forgotten jewel. Structure so immense that its shadow swallowed moons, its corridors long, enough to lose civilizations in its central chamber, large enough to seat the representatives of 412 species. Simultaneously, it had taken humanity 300 years of petitioning, 2 diplomatic collapses, 1 near war with a border species, called the VTHCAN, and the quiet sacrifice of an entire generation of Earth's finest legal minds just to earn an invitation, not a seat. An invitation. Dr. Yara Ase stepped off the transport docking ring and into the light of 1,000 alien suns refracted through observatory glass, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the weight of the moment. 3 seconds. Then she straightened her collar, picked up her case, and walked forward. She was 61 years old. She had been preparing for this day since she was 19. The human delegation was 12 people, 12 out of the tens of thousands that moved through the conclave station. On any given cycle, they were assigned quarters in Sector 47, the outermost residential ring, where the recycled air tasted faintly metallic and the gravity calibration was slightly off, just enough to make your knees ache. By evening, nobody said it was intentional. Nobody needed to. The council chamber itself was a marvel of alien architecture, a vast tired amphitheater carved from a single piece of living crystal that hummed at a frequency just below hearing. So every species in attendance always felt, without knowing why, a faint and constant unease. The seats cascaded downward toward a central floor of polished black stone where the presiding speaker stood. The older, more powerful species sat closest to the floor. Everyone else receded upward into the tiers, diminishing in status with every row. Humanity's designated place was not in the tiers, it was in the observation box, a transparent enclosure suspended above the left gallery, visible to the entire chamber like a display case, like a curiosity in a museum, soundproofed from the outside by default. No voting console, no speaking rights, no translation relay to the main floor, unless specifically granted by the presiding speaker. They could watch, they could listen, they could not participate. It was technically more than they'd had before. Yara took her seat in the front row of the box and looked down at the chamber filling below her. She watched 400 species take their places with the casual comfort of people who had been doing this for centuries. The breath Dominion's delegation swept in last, always theatrical. 12 FT, tall, silver-caled, their ceremonial robes trailing like liquid mercury across the black stone floor. High Speaker Zaleth Thorne moved to the central podium with the slow, deliberate grace of something that had never once been told to hurry. He was by breath reckoning 4,000 years old. He had personally presided over the admission of 19 new species to the council. He had a reputation for eloquence, for cutting wit, and for a particular brand of casual cruelty that was always wrapped so beautifully in ceremony that no one ever quite called it what it was. He called the 4,000 session to order. He read through 3 hours of procedural business without a single error, and then, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once considered consequences, he turned to the agenda item labeled Formal Acknowledgement of Earth Observer Status, Sol System Tier 7. He looked up at the observation box. The chamber followed his gaze. 400. Species, thousands of eyes, all shapes and colors, all turning upward toward the 12 humans suspended in their glass, box-like specimens. Zelthan smiled. "Let it be noted," he said, his voice ringing through the translation relay with perfect universal clarity, broadcast simultaneously to every ship, station, and inhabited world in Galactic Council space, that the carbon-burning primates of the third rock have finally learned to knock on doors. He paused. Let it land. How he tilted his great silver head, quaint. The chamber erupted, not in malicious roaring that would have been too obvious, too crude for a body this ancient and sophisticated. It was worse than that. It was laughter of genuine amusement, the light, dismissive laughter of people who found a child's drawing charming. Species that had been enemies for centuries shared the moment. The sound rolled upward and pressed against the observation glass like a physical thing. Yara Osa did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the small desk in front of her, her expression composed, her eyes clear. Around her she could feel her delegation holding their breath, feel the heat of humiliation radiating off her junior colleagues, feel one of the younger Adashes trembling slightly in his seat. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out a small paper notepad. Real paper, deliberately anachronistic. Something she'd carried since her first year of law school. She uncapped her pen. She wrote 4 words beneath her. Zalith Thorn moved on to the next agenda item as though nothing of significance had occurred, because to him nothing had. On Earth 4 billion people watched the broadcast in silence. A schoolgirl in Karachi sat in front of a projector screen with her entire class, all of them motionless. A retired general in Sao Paulo stood in his kitchen and gripped his coffee cup until his knuckles went white. In a research facility in Osaka, a team of engineers working on the 6th-generation ion drive paused mid-calculation. They all saw the same thing. Their ambassador in her glass box above the most powerful gathering in known space, sitting perfectly still, writing something in a notepad. A camera drone drifted close enough to the observation glass. The broadcast caught the angle for just a moment before Yara shifted her hand long enough for the 4 words to be read by every human watching. Day 1. They'll remember this. The school girl in Karachi looked at her teacher. Her teacher was crying, not from shame. The girl was too young to understand at first, and then slowly she did. It wasn't a reaction, it was a promise. The report was called Xenological Assessment File 7714C. Sol System, Indigenous Civilization, Common Designation Human. It had taken the Galactic Survey Bureau 200 years to compile, and High Speaker Zalith Thorn released it to the galactic public 3 days after humanity's first council session, because timing, he understood, was everything. The galactic net lit up instantly. The report was translated into 400 languages within hours, shared across every inhabited system, dissected and mocked on 1,000 platforms. Commentary channels ran it on loops. Species who had never once thought about the Sol system suddenly had opinions. The numbers were brutal. Average lifespan negligible by galactic standards, barely 8 decades. Under natural conditions, technological tier classification prescendent, rudimentary, dependent on combustion and early-stage fusion, military threat, index effectively 0, psychological profile dangerously unstable, Chronic. Intracees aggression statistically. Prone to civilizational. Self-destruction, the Bureau's own. Recommendation included without. Diplomatic softening, monitor at. Distance, do not engage meaningfully, do. Not arm, do not educate probability of. Self-extinction within next 2,000 years. 73%. Zaleth Thorne gave an interview in which he described humanity as a compelling case study in a species that nearly destroyed itself before it could destroy anyone else and called their counsel admission a gesture of compassion toward the cosmically unfortunate. The interview received the highest viewership of any council broadcast in recorded history. What the report did not contain, what 200 years of careful, distant, never once landing observation had utterly failed to capture was something far more dangerous than anything the Bureau had thought to measure. It had measured humanity's wars without understanding that every single one had been a laboratory, not just for weapons but for logistics, psychology, encryption, supply chains, medical, trauma response, material science, and the absolute outer limits of what a human body and mind could endure before breaking. Other species had experienced war as catastrophe and then mercifully stopped. Humanity had experienced it as catastrophe, rebuilt, made notes, and filed them. It had measured humanity's lifespan without accounting for what a species does when it knows its time is short. Every human alive understood in a way no long-lived species truly could. That time was running out, that urgency, that deep biological inescapable urgency. Compressed innovation cycles down to decades instead of centuries. What the took 300 years to iterate. Humanity iterated in 30, not because humans were smarter, because humans were desperate in a way only mortal things can be. It had flagged human tribalism as a structural weakness. It had never considered what happened when all those tribes found a common enemy. Most critically, the variable the Bureau's models had never even attempted to quantify, because no other species their database had ever weaponized it at civilizational scale. Was spite, not rage, not ambition, not survival instinct, despite pure cold, extraordinarily patient spite. In Sector 47 of the Eternal Conclave Station, Ambassador Yara Oi read the full report on a Tuesday morning with a cup of terrible recycled coffee and a notepad beside her. She took 6 pages of notes. Then she encrypted them and forwarded them to Earth Strategic Development Commission with a subject line that read, "They handed us the exam. Begin prep." She received a reply 4 hours later. It was from Dr. Amcha Osunwaku, her younger brother, who ran the Commission's long-range planning division. The reply contained no words, just a timestamp, a projected calendar entry set 60 years in the future, labeled simply delivery date. She smiled, finished her coffee, went to sit in the observation box for another day of watching, listening, and saying nothing. On the Galactic net, the commentary about humanity peaked that week, and then, as these things always do, faded. Other news replaced it, other crises, other dramas, other species doing more interesting things. The survey report was filed in archives. Humanity was forgotten, which was, of course, exactly what they needed. Here is what the galaxy saw during those 60 years. Nothing remarkable. A small, quiet observer delegation that attended every council session faithfully, that sat in their glass box, that occasionally submitted written questions through the official observer query system, most of which were procedural, dry bordering on tedious, that traded modestly with minor species, that issued no military postures, made no territorial claims, caused no incidents. Humanity, the galactic community largely agreed had accepted its place. Here is what was actually happening. In the third year of Rithaline Merchant vessel made a routine stop at a human trade station near the Jupiter Relay. The crew sold what they listed in the manifest as decorative alloy display sample, small tiles of a composite material used in breath warship hull. Plating sold as curios, the kind of low value trinket that minor species like to collect. The merchant made a small profit, filed the transaction, forgot about it. Human metallurgists spent 4 months analyzing the tiles. They published nothing, they filed no patents, they simply worked quietly, obsessively in a laboratory in Bangalore that officially processed deep-sea mineral samples. By year 8 they were producing a hull composite with 12% better stress fracture resistance than the breath original. They built it into every new vessel quietly without announcement. In the 17th year, a human Xenol linguistics professor named Dr. James App attended a galactic academic conference as an observer, the only tier permitted to human academics, and spent 3 evenings in conversation with a Kathsari physicist named Velharan, who was charming and brilliant and slightly drunk on something that smelled like burnt cinnamon. Velharan described his species unified FTL framework as elementary stuff, honestly mostly solved. Just the stabilization variables are messy. He spoke about it the way people talk about their work when they want to seem impressive but don't want to seem like they're trying. Dr. Ock listened very carefully, asked exactly the right questions, remembered everything. 3 years later, a human-authored paper published by the Sol System Institute for Applied Physics solved the stabilization variables in Velharan's framework, acknowledged his foundation contributions by name, and presented a complete functional unified FTL theory that galactic physicists had been circling for centuries. The paper was the most discussed scientific document on the galactic net in a generation. Velharan woke up famous. He sent a message that said only, "I did not expect this." Ob replied, "We noticed the gap. Thank you for pointing us toward it." 42 species downloaded the paper within a week. 11 of them began FTL drive upgrades within a year. None of them forgot who published it. In year 34, the Council's Infrastructure Committee denied Earth's application to construct a second jump relay point in the outer Sol system, citing humanity's observer status as grounds for restricted infrastructure development. The denial was filed by a breath block committee member who took 4 minutes to process it and then moved on with his day. Humanity's legal team spent 6 months reviewing the galactic infrastructure accords of 3200 CE. They found buried in Appendix 14C of a subclause regarding self-contained non-relayed dependent point navigation beacons, a provision that had never been used because no species had ever bothered developing the underlying technology. A fundamentally different navigational architecture that didn't use the relay network at all and therefore required no council approval whatsoever. They built 7. By year 50, the unease in certain council corridors was quiet but undeniable. an aid to a breath. Council member filed an internal memo, noting that the human observer delegation has demonstrated an unusual pattern of legal and scientific activity that warrants monitoring. The memo was reviewed, acknowledged, and filed. By year 60, Yara Osa had retired from the ambassadorship, returned to Earth, taught international relations for a decade, published 2 books, and died in her sleep at age 89 in her home in Accra. Her granddaughter, 12 years old, sat at her bedside in the final week and asked her if she was proud of what she'd done. Yara looked at her for a long moment. She said, "I planted seeds, sweetheart. I won't see the harvest, but you might." She passed with her notepad on the bedside table, the last entry dated 2 days before she died. Read day 21,915. Right on schedule. The annexation of Drevon's Reach happened on a Tuesday, which seemed in retrospect an appropriately undramatic day for what the KTH hegemony genuinely believed was a routine territorial maneuver. The logic was clean. Drevon's Reach was a single-system civilization, small, pacifist, non-council, no military, no powerful allies. Beneath its third planet's crust lay the largest deposit of Vidian crystal in the known sector, material critical for next generation computation arrays. The KTH needed it. The Drevon could not stop them. No council member had enough interest in the Drevon to intervene on their behalf. The whole operation was projected to take 6 weeks. It took 4. The KTH moved in warships, established orbital dominance, and issued the Drevon a formal absorption notice. The Drevon, being pacifists, did not fire a single shot. They broadcast a distress signal on all frequencies, instead a practice their culture had held sacred for centuries, the belief that if you called out clearly enough, someone would hear you. Someone did. In the council session that followed, the observer box was quiet as usual. The Cathser's lead representative gave a smooth, prepared address to the chamber, framing the annexation as a voluntary integration and mutual development arrangement. The language was excellent. The supporting documentation was thorough. Several council members were already composing approving responses. Then the speaker's relay crackled with an unfamiliar request code. Observer delegation Sol system requested the floor. The chamber paused. It was by some counts the first formal floor request filed by a human delegation. 61 years. The legal entitlement was clear. Observers could request speaking rights on humanitarian grounds, a provision that had been in the charter for millennia and had never once been invoked by a human delegation. It was granted mostly out of curiosity. Ambassador Kofi Osmensah, Yara's grandson, 44 years old, dressed immaculately in a dark suit that somehow communicated both profound respect for the chamber and absolute indifference to anyone in it, walked to the observer podium. He did not use notes. He began with the KTH own founding charter, specifically Article 7, Clause 3, the non-aggression principle. The hegemony had authored themselves in 2847 CE, which prohibited the forced incorporation of non-threatening civilizations. He quoted it from memory, verbatim in original KTH. The chamber went very still. He then walked through the financial architecture of the annexation, the Vidian crystal deposits, the projected extraction timeline, the supply contracts already quietly pre-signed with Kethser aligned. Manufacturing firms, the profit. Projections, he presented this not as accusation but as documentation, simply. The facts laid end to end, which was sometimes far more devastating than any accusation. He paused, let the chamber absorb it. Then he said, I would like to place before this body a motion for retroactive protectorate status for Drevon's reach, effective from the date of occupation. The breath block moved immediately to dismiss Zaleth Thorne, himself ancient now, moving with the careful deliberateness of extreme age. His silver scales faded slightly too. Gray raised his hand and began to speak. Kofi waited politely until he was finished, then he added before the vote, I'd like to enter into the record an index of current council members whose active commercial shipping contracts pass through Drevon's reach, contracts that would be voided under Kethsari annexation due to territorial exclusivity clauses in a G-Mani commercial law. He read the list, 14 names, 14 council members who had been sitting quietly and had fully planned to abstain. None of them abstained. The motion passed. The Kthsari were formally censured. The Drevon were protected. Back in the observer box, the human junior delegation was struggling visibly to contain their reactions. One young woman had tears running silently down her face. Two of the men were gripping each other's arms. Kofi returned to the box and sat down. An aide leaned over and whispered, Ambassador, they're going to come after us for this. Kofi nodded. Yes, he said simply, that's the point. Breath response came not as a thunderclap but as a slow, suffocating pressure, the kind of force that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't. It began with paperwork, human trade, operating licenses issued under observer. Commercial access agreements were flagged for compliance review. The review process under council administrative law could take between 6 months and 6 years. In the meantime, licenses were suspended. Human merchant vessels found themselves unable to legally dock at 17 major galactic trading hubs. The economic impact was significant. The message was clear. 3 weeks later, human researchers embedded in 4 joint galactic science programs received formal termination notices. The program cited restructuring of contributor eligibility criteria, new language inserted retroactively into program charters by breath-aligned administrative directors that required full member status for participation. Observator contributors were thanked for their service and removed. A researcher named Dr. Suman Park had been embedded in the Galactic Epidemiological Consortium for 11 years. She had developed in that time a disease modeling algorithm that had saved an estimated 3 million lives across 6 species. She packed her personal belongings into a crate, said goodbye to her colleagues, and boarded the transit home. She did not cry until she was past the docking ring. The final move was the most elegant and the most dangerous. The council passed resolution 4847, a seemingly technical piece of legislation clarifying the legal classification of interstellar vessels by member tier. In the fine print, all military-grade ships operated by observer species were reclassified as unlicensed aggressor-class vessels. The resolution passed in a late session with low attendance, minimal debate, and was written in sufficiently dense legal language that most members voted without fully reading it under this classification, every human military vessel in Council space was now technically illegal, subject to impound, subject to use of force if they refused to stand down. The breath had, essentially with a single resolution, rendered Earth defenseless in galactic space without firing a shot. The galaxy watched to see what humanity would do. Some expected capitulation, some expected rage, some expected nothing, because even now many species still have expected that humanity would simply absorb the punishment and accept its place. Earth did three things simultaneously, all announced on a single morning, coordinated across time zones, so not a single human asset moved before the others were ready. The first, Earth's entire technology archive, 61 years of quiet innovation, every paper, every patent, every development that had been filed internally and never published was released as open source on the Galactic Net, freely available, no licensing restrictions, no usage fees, in 400 languages, infrastructure systems, medical protocols, agricultural frameworks, materials science, FTL, refinements, navigation architecture. All of it. The Galactic Net buckled under the download traffic within hours. 43 unaffiliated minor civilizations began immediate implementation programs. 7 of them issued formal public statements of gratitude within the first day. The Drevon, protected now under Council Protectorate status, were the first. Their statement was the shortest. We will not forget. The second, a 600-page legal analysis authored by the Sol System Institute for Galactic Law, was published demonstrating with meticulous citation that resolution 4847, as written, classified 40% of the breath Dominion's own deep space exploration fleet as unlicensed aggressor class, under the resolution's own definition. The analysis was technically neutral. Tone, it did not accuse, it simply pointed the commentary channels. Collapsed under the response volume, the breath legal team issued a rebuttal. Within 48 hours, human legal scholars published a counter rebuttal. Within 6 hours of that, the breath issued another. The humans published another. By the 5th exchange, 3 neutral galactic legal bodies had announced independent reviews, all of them quietly trending toward the human interpretation. The third, humanity filed a formal application for full member status in the Galactic Council, co-sponsored by 43 civilizations, each with their documentation in order and their reasoning stated plainly. An emergency session was called. It was the first emergency session convened for a membership application in the Council's 4,000-year history. In his private chambers aboard the conclave station, Zaleth Thorn stood before a full-length mirror. For a long time, something had shifted in him, not fear exactly, but a feeling that rhymed with it, an ancient thing, learning for the first time that the ground could move. He composed himself, returned to his desk, began reviewing counter-arguments. There were fewer good ones than he expected. The vote was scheduled for the 463rd session, 3 months away. Those 3 months were the most intensely lobbed period in Galactic Council history. The Verith called in favors that were decades old. Zalathorn personally visited 11 council members. Private audience, a gesture so rare from the Verith High Speaker that each visit was reported as a major political event. He was gracious, he was persuasive, he was those who met with him said, privately also visibly tired in a way that the very old sometimes look when something they've always believed in has begun to feel less certain. His argument, refined across 11 meetings, came down to 3 points. Humanity was statistically violent, humanity was culturally immature, and humanity's admission would set a precedent for accelerated integration of underprepared civilizations that could destabilize the Council's structural balance. He believed genuinely that all three were true. He was not entirely wrong. That was what made it complicated. On the other side, the 43 co-sponsoring civilizations each submitted formal testimony. Most were 2 or 3 pages. Endorsements, declarations of support, statements of aligned interest, standard diplomatic language. The Drevon Elder Council submitted 40 pages. They detailed in careful sequence what the 30-year trading relationship with Earth had meant for their civilization. The technical transfers, yes, but also the small dignities. The humans who learned their language before visiting rather than expecting translation. The human trade representative who, during a drought cycle 12 years ago, had quietly routed a supply contract to send Drevon food synthesizers that weren't in the original agreement. The Drevon elder who had died peacefully, rather than in an occupation camp, because someone had shown up. The chamber was very quiet during the Drevon testimony. A delegation of 3 Drevon elders stood to speak in person. Eldest, a woman whose age translated to approximately 200 years, stood at the speaker's podium in a chamber that could hold a 100,000 and addressed 400 species. In a voice that was very small and very clear, she spoke for 22 minutes. She described what it was to be small in a galaxy that only noticed the large. She described the moment the human transmission had reached them during the occupation, not a military response, not a political intervention at first, just a message that said, "We see you, we are coming, hold on." She described what those words had meant to her people. She finished, sat down. The chamber was completely silent for 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, 41 delegates who had been undecided made their decisions. The vote was announced in the 463rd session, 214 in favor, 9 opposed, 3 abstentions. Earth was admitted as a full member of the Galactic Council of Ascended Civilizations. By law, the longest-serving High Speaker of the Council was required to formally welcome each new member. Zala Thorne rose. He was 4,063 years old. He had welcomed 19 species to this chamber. He read the ceremonial words from the ancient text, the same words that had been read at every induction for 4,000 years, in a voice that was correct in every technical aspect and empty of warmth in every human sense. He got through it, sat down. The new human member seat was installed on the main floor, front row, directly facing the presiding chair, directly across the central aisle from the Breath Dominions delegation. Kofi Ase walked down from the observation box, walked down from it for the last time, and took his seat on the floor. He sat down, his briefcase, opened it, took out a small note on me. What it was at first. 20 years watch. The first Earth's mechanism, older civilized votes on resile. Effective control, regardless of how many New members were admitted. Humanity through Kobe had been careful. Like a human initiative. 13 months in private conversation with mid-tier council members, learning their specific grievances, understanding exactly how the waiting system had disadvantaged them for centuries. He simply helped them find the language for what they had always wanted to say. When the motion was finally introduced, it was co-authored by 11 species. None of them were human. Humanity was the 12th name on the document. It passed 197 to 26 in the breath delegations. Private gallery that evening. Zalith Thorn watched the procedural recording of the vote on repeat 3 times. He was trying to identify where it had gone wrong. The problem he kept arriving at and then rejecting was that it had gone wrong everywhere in 100 small moments over 20 years in 1,000 conversations. He'd never been in the room for. The second reform came 4 years later, a comprehensive restructuring of the Galactic trade framework, dismantling the breath-controlled shipping consortium that had operated as the unofficial backbone of galactic commerce. For 1,100 years, the consortium extracted passage fees, set routing priorities, and quietly throttled economic development in species that fell out of breath political favor. Most civilizations had accepted this as simply how things worked. The way weather was simply how things were. Earth's trade economists published a 1,200-page analysis showing exactly in precise and devastating numerical terms how much wealth had been extracted from which civilizations over which periods. They published it not to the council floor but to the galactic public. Species that had always vaguely sensed they were being shortchanged now had the math. The political pressure that followed was not generated by humanity. Humanity didn't need to generate it. The legal dissolution of the consortium took 3 years and 94 separate council motions. Not one of them was authored by a human delegate. The breath dominion was not broken. They remained old. They remained powerful in their way. They retained their seat and their voice. But the architecture that had silently multiplied their power for centuries had been taken apart piece by piece without a single act of overt aggression removed. The way you dismantle a machine with patience and the right tools and a clear understanding of which bolt holds what together. In the 32nd year of Earth's membership, Zalathorn requested a private meeting with Ambassador Kofi Osmensa. The message came through official channels, formally worded, requesting a bilateral discussion at the ambassador's convenience. Kofi arrived alone. Zalathorn was already in the room, standing at the window of his private office, looking out at the starfield. He was leaning on a support staff, now 4,095 years old. Still immense, still silver-caled, but quieter in a way that great things become when they have lived past the time of their greatest certainty. He did not turn around immediately. He spoke to the starfield. What do you want from us? Kofi sat down. He considered the question for a moment, with genuine respect, because it was, he thought, the first honest question Zalathorn had ever directed at a human. Nothing, he said. We wanted a seat at the table. You gave it to us. Eventually, Zalathorn was quiet for a long time. He turned from the window. He looked at Kofi Osmensa with eyes that had watched civilizations rise and disappear. I said something unforgivable on the day you arrived. He said it was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement which, from a 4,000-year-old being of that disposition. Was possibly harder, Kofi nodded. You did was all of this, Zalithorn gestured a slow sweep of his aged hand. That seemed to encompass the last 60 years. Was it because of that day? Kofi thought about his grandmother, about a notepad, about a schoolgirl in Karach, about a fisherman, about engineers who stayed late because they had something to prove to a galaxy that didn't know they existed yet. It started there, he said, but it was never really about you. 112 years after the 4,000th session, the Eternal Conclave Station was a different place. The observation box above the left gallery had been removed, decommissioned, its transparent panels dismantled 15 years after Earth's admission, when a motion passed to convert all observer enclosures into additional floor seating in acknowledgement of the expanded membership. Where the box had been, there was now a row of seats occupied by a delegation from a species called the Maravath, admitted 3 years ago, still learning the procedures, still slightly awed by the scale of the chamber. Humanity's seat on the main floor was in the 7th row, now moved back as newer members pushed older ones further from the center, which was how it was supposed to work. Kofi Osmondsa had died 20 years ago. 3 ambassadors had followed him. The current human representative was a young woman named Ambassador Adiz Chukwa, 37 years old, who had grown up in Logos, watching archive footage of the 4,000th session in a history class, and had decided at 11 what she would do with her life. She walked past the plaque every morning on her way to the chamber. It had been installed by unanimous council vote in the 4,100th session, a small unadorned rectangle of polished black stone set into the wall near the main entrance. The inscription was brief. It had been written by the Drevon Elder Council in this hall in the 4,000th session. The people of Earth were mocked before the galaxy. They did not leave. They did not rage. They did not beg. They got to work. On this particular morning, a young breath diplomat named Kython was standing in front of the plaque when Kyth's son was barely 400 years old, young by breath reckoning, and had been assigned to the council as a junior at a 6 months ago. She was reading the plaque with an expression that Adiz had learned to recognize, the particular quality of stillness that meant someone was encountering a story they'd heard in a new way. Adiz slowed, stopped beside her. Is it true? Khan asked without turning. All of it. Which part? The young breath gestured at the plaque. Way it happened, the 60 years doing all of that quietly, without making noise about it. Yes, Adiz considered. There's a phrase in one of our older languages. We translate it roughly as living well is the best revenge, but the original is better. It's closer to the most powerful thing you can do to someone who dismissed you is become undismissible. Season was quiet for a moment. My great elder was there, she said. Zale Thorn. He spoke to one of your ambassadors near the end before he died. She paused. He told me once that the thing he regretted most wasn't losing the vote waiting system or the consortium. He said the thing he couldn't stop thinking about was what he'd said at the 4,000th session. He said he hadn't thought about it for years, but at the end he thought about it often. Ad nodded slowly. That's usually how it works, she said. In the council archive maintained in a climate-controlled vault on sublevel 12, there was a small exhibit dedicated to the history of Earth's succession. It contained the original trade manifests, the legal briefs, the Resolution 484. Protected behind pre's. The exhibit explained its significance. Visitors to look at the last entry from 2 days before. The first page words was nothing, day 1 they'll. School group visited the exhibit field. Teacher species brought their students and let them through glass and what they would the newly atom. She would look at the notepad at those 4 words, still crisp, still clear, and she would think about a woman she'd never met who had sat very still in front of 400 species and chosen instead of anger or despair to write a promise. She never tired of it. She didn't think she ever would. Outside the chamber was filling, 427 species taking their seats. The hum of 1,000 conversations in 1,000 languages, the low frequency vibration of the living crystal walls, the particular quality of light that came through the observatory glass and fell across the floor in long golden columns. Adise put her hand briefly against the glass of the exhibit case, not touching the notepad, just the glass beside it, and then she turned, squared her shoulders, and walked into the chamber to take her seat. There was work to do, and